Hello and welcome to our investigation. Today, we are diving headfirst into a really big debate in higher education, political bias on college campuses. There's a lot of noise out there, so we're going to cut right through it, follow the data, and see if we can figure out what's really going on.
And really, it all boils down to this one question. Are universities still these amazing places for open inquiry, or are they kind of pushing a specific worldview? It's a question on pretty much everyone's mind, from students and their parents to the faculty themselves. So let's dig in.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to start with the numbers, just to get a sense of the scale of this campus lean. Then, we'll take a step back in time to understand how we even got here. After that, we'll step right into the classroom to see what the real-world impact is, hear from all sides of the argument, and finally, see if we can find some common ground.
All right, let's get into Section 1, the campus lean. Before we get into any stories or opinions, I think it's best to start with the hard numbers. What do the statistics actually say about the political makeup of college faculty today?
Okay, check this out. What's really striking here is just the sheer scale of the imbalance. On a national average, when you look at the surveys, for every one professor who leans conservative, there are about 10 who identify as liberal. And this ratio is especially pronounced in fields like the humanities and social sciences.
And in some disciplines, that gap, well, it becomes a giant chasm. This is a perfect illustration of the extreme end of the spectrum. If you take a field like anthropology, for example, some studies have found the ratio can be as high as 42 liberal professors for every single conservative one. It just highlights how concentrated that ideological lean can get in certain corners of academia.
But it is absolutely crucial to add some nuance here. The faculty clearly leans left, we've seen that. But does that mean campuses are crawling with Marxists, like some headlines might make you think? Well, the data says not really. Research shows that self-identified Marxists actually make up a tiny minority of professors, usually somewhere around 3 to 5%. The huge majority hold other, more mainstream liberal or progressive views.
So, the numbers show a definite ideological tilt. But that begs the question, right? Was it always this way? Let's jump into Section 2 and take a look at the history to see how things have evolved. The political landscape of academia has changed so dramatically. If you go back to the 1950s, the McCarthy era was actively pushing left-leaning professors out. By 1969, things were actually pretty balanced, about 46% liberal to 28% conservative. But the real major shift, that happened after 1998. The generation shaped by the cultural movements of the 60s and 70s became the senior faculty, and that's when the liberal share just surged past 60%, while the conservative share dropped all the way to around 12%.
Okay, so we've looked at the data, we've gone through the history, but what does all of this actually mean inside the classroom? What does it feel like for students? Let's explore the impact on learning itself.
When you look at the research, you really do see two sides of this coin. On the one hand, a faculty that leans left often brings a powerful emphasis on social justice, on equity, and a critical examination of power structures. And that could be great for amplifying voices that have been historically marginalized. But on the other hand, the biggest concern you hear is the risk of creating an ideological echo chamber, where students get less exposure to different ideas and might even start to, self-censor.
And that term, self-censorship, is so important here. It's that feeling when you hold back from saying what you really think because you're worried about getting a bad grade or, social backlash from your peers. And this isn't some fringe idea. Surveys from the group FIRE, that's the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, find that over half of all students, liberal, conservative, you name it, admit to doing this.
However, and this is a huge however, here's a crucial counterpoint. Despite all the concern about indoctrination, multiple large-scale studies have found that students' political beliefs really only change a little bit during college. The small shift to the left that you do see, it often just mirrors the exact same trend happening among young people in society as a whole. This suggests that professors aren't just hitting a switch and reprogramming their students' politics. So it's a really complex picture, isn't it? Now let's hear from the key players in this whole debate. Because, as you can imagine, where you stand on this often depends on where you sit. So, who believes what? Well, progressive academics will often argue that the lean isn't a bias at all, but a natural outcome of a field that's committed to critical analysis and social justice. Conservative commentators, on the other hand, worry that this imbalance creates one-sided classes and can even stifle research.
Then you've got centrist groups like the nonprofit Heterodox Academy, who argue for more viewpoint diversity, not for its own sake, but because they believe it actually makes academic work sharper and more rigorous. And finally, you have the public, where polls show that trust in higher education is actually falling, partly because of this perceived bias.
And this quote from social psychologist Jonathan Haidt really nails the heart of that centrist argument. He's saying the point isn't to hit some perfect 50-50 political split. The real goal is to build an environment where different ideas can be challenged in a constructive way, because that whole process of disagreement is what gets us closer to finding the truth.
This leads us perfectly into our final section. I mean, given all these competing arguments and all this complex data, what are the potential paths forward? Are there any constructive solutions that maybe everyone could get behind?
Well, the good news is people are trying out some really concrete solutions. Some of the key ideas floating around are universities adopting a policy of institutional neutrality on political issues, using blind reviews for papers and even for hiring to reduce potential bias, actively teaching students how to disagree constructively, and supporting student clubs that bring different political groups together for dialogue.
Let's just zoom in on that idea of institutional neutrality for a second. A lot of this thinking is based on a really famous document from way back in 1967 called the Calvin Report. The core idea is super simple. The university, as a whole, should stay out of political fights. The purpose? To protect the freedom of every individual professor and student to dissent and to explore any idea they want, without the university putting its thumb on the scale. And this matters so much because it lets the university be a home for critics of all kinds, instead of becoming a critic itself. And all of this leaves us with one final big thought. In an age that feels so deeply divided, is it possible for universities to resist just being another battleground? Can they become a place that actually models the difficult, respectful dialogue we so desperately need, instead of just mirroring the divides we already have? The answer to that question could end up shaping not just the future of education, but really our society as a whole. Thanks for joining this investigation.